I would like to talk of the experiences we have had with the Stanford New Ensemble over the past 2 years as we had to transition from in-person to online rehearsing and performing. This was made possible thanks to the invaluable commitment and energy of the people working at CARMA, the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics at Stanford, led by Chris Chafe, who helped us performers get online in order to be able to maintain our musical activities with the best possible conditions under the circumstances. As we were getting more familiar with JackTrip, a software developed by Chris Chafe and Juan Pablo Caceres at CARMA for high-quality uncompressed audio used in network performance, the participants of the ensemble and I were starting to develop our understanding of the particulars of online music making on a musical level as well as on an aesthetic level. Questions of student engagement and community making in this particular context were also critical to us. I will be presenting some of the outcomes of the reflective thought as it emerged since engaging in network performance. I'll start by discussing the necessity for an explicit aesthetic investigation into distributed performance, some of its particular problematics and stakes. The literature devoted to distributed performance has blossomed over the past 20 years. A significant number of these publications have quite legitimately dealt primarily with technical concerns as to the ways real-time interactions could be achieved, starting with video telephone with images updating every 5 seconds in the 1990s to near zero or ultra low latency with JackTrip and other software. If publications from the early 2000s, such as Craig Saper's Networked Art and Anna Munster and Gert Loving's thesis on distributed aesthetics, have engaged with the challenge posed by distributed performances to the very nature of artworks, it nonetheless remains common for performers to consider online performance, however high the quality, as always a substitute. The ideal scenario is presumed always to be on-site presence shared with audience members. Since 2019, the Journal of Network Music and Arts, a peer-reviewed open access digital research journal published by Stony Brook University, has been offering a transdisciplinary approach to a diversity of questions raised by network performance beyond the already existing literature of technological import. The questions addressed involve network art technologies such as JackTrip, LoLa, a low latency, high quality audio video transmission system for network musical performances and interaction, virtual reality, OBS Studio for open broadcaster software, and other software. The journal also engages with thematic approaches in which aesthetics has found its place. For example, the latest issue focused on the notion of distance and its transformations, whether physical, emotional, societal, environmental, and dimensional, to quote Sarah River, editor-in-chief. In addition to the innovations and technological developments in network performance since the pandemic began, this performance practice has thus lent itself to the emergence of a vast corpus of research questions. This context calls for the progress of a philosophical and aesthetic inquiry that could potentially inform performers, researchers, and technologists, a perspective I would compare to Hubert Dreyfus' phenomenology-based approach to technology in his critique of AI, which led to an enhanced dialogue between philosophers and AI engineers that culminated in technological developments founded precisely upon the results of this dialogue. I would like to talk briefly of the way network performance can help reframe traditional questions in aesthetics. Such common notions in aesthetics as the concept of presence, from Plato to Derrida through Heidegger, traditionally linked to the notion of presentation. I'll give just one example from Heidegger's Of the Beaten Track, presentation is a natural mode of presence. So, as I said, traditionally linked to the notion of presentation, need to be rearticulated or investigated in the light of the notion of telepresence, which is of such critical importance since the development of VR and augmented reality in the arts. Jack Loomis' 1994 article, Distal Attribution and Presence, is foundational here, as is Stephen Jones' Towards a Philosophy of Virtual Reality, Issues Implicit in Consciousness Reframed, 1997. A more recent publication of primary interest is Unstum Augmented Voyage, a platform for telematic live performances in augmented reality by Nicola Hein, Claudia Schmitz, and Sven Hane, published in 2022. If traditionally the notion of presence in art has been linked to that of truth, the ontology of the work of art must question the way telepresence challenges its fundamental assumptions. Because of the focus on technical aspects, there was a lack of development of aesthetic thought. Thus, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, an opportunity was missed to renew or reframe canonical aesthetic questions in the context of a performance practice that, by virtue of the communities it serves and reaches out to, paradigmatically associates art and technology. Some of the questions raised by distributed performance, such as the nature and qualities of the virtual sonic space in which the performers meet, extend beyond a solely aesthetic inquiry. Just as I mentioned, the example of the notion of presence, phanestai, or telepresence, and touch also upon questions of philosophy of mind. Are musical mental phenomena internal or external? Are they to be found within the mind, or are they only real inasmuch as they are actualized in the public sphere? What if this reality is enacted in a virtual space, etc., etc.? These are some of the questions that would benefit from being confronted to philosophical approaches other than aesthetics under the paradigm of subject philosophy, a paradigm Heidegger, for example, remains under the influence of, even though he's distancing himself from it. I would like to mention here a recent interdisciplinary contribution to the question of space in its aesthetic and cognitive dimensions, the Laser Talk, Laser for Leonardo Art Science Evening Rendezvous, organized by Aalto University, Aalto with 2A, in 2021, that brought together artists and scientists to discuss these notions from multiple perspectives. Sorry. I would like to lay emphasis on the fact that thinking the concept of space also has merits on a strictly musical level as well. A number of questions and assumptions of compositional and/or theoretical significance could also be reassessed in the light of the experiences to which online jamming exposes participants. One of the most obvious being here the question of reconciling improvisation and composition, improvisation in writing, or notions such as musical discourse in improvisation and written music, etc. Since many contexts in which networked performance is produced call for improvisation. Another obvious area of questioning is the concept of space and how musical space can be elaborated compositionally, how it differs from one composer to the next, how different compositional approaches entail a particular relation to the notion of space, compositionally speaking, whether tonal, polytonal, atonal, metatonal, concrete, stochastic, repetitive. Thus, internet acoustics and audio panning systems could go hand in hand with a reflection of space as an intraspecific category of compositional practice. In that context, it would be particularly interesting to question whether or not the technological means used entail a predetermination of certain aesthetic aspects, or whether the technology employed has no aesthetic qualities. In the same way, Langdon Winner, in his canonical essay from 1980, Do Artifacts Have Politics?, investigated whether, beyond mere efficiency, technical things, as he calls them, were embodying specific forms of power and authority. Network performance calls for reevaluating the notion of artwork itself. To give an example, as mentioned earlier, if traditionally the notion of presence in art has been linked to that of truth, the ontology of the work of art has to take into consideration the modifications that it undergoes since the emergence of the concept of telepresence. The theory of telematics is rooted in questions pertaining to the philosophy of technology, notably that of the articulation of the social sphere of cultural practices and of the technological sphere. Concretely, this means that questions are raised about technological determinism applied to ensemble music, questions of reverse adaptation, and of the social practices linked to the traditional practice of music in Western societies. To take a concrete example, how can telematics help call into question or reformulate certain fundamental assumptions in Western classical music, such as the distinction between the categories of improvisers and composers? While this question is not specific to telematics, network performance poses it with particular insistence. Besides asking whether network performance bears predetermined aesthetic attributes, or whether it is a transparent environment on which technological constructivism has no hold, the issue that I would like to address here is that of the decentering of the figure of the composer. In doing so, I hope to establish what aspects of the discussion are dependent upon the technological artifact or made possible by the artifact, or whether this decentering is cultural in nature, i.e., emerges from the supportive and collaborative nature of the community of music practitioners who work with technology. If telematics does not entail the death of the author in the structuralist sense of the term, à la Barthes, The Death of the Author, 1967, or Foucault, What is an Author, 1969, it leads to what I would call a decentering and redistribution of the role of the composer, concomitant with the reevaluation of the traditional distribution of roles in Western musical practices. Telematics has the ability to reformulate the spatial distribution of instruments, as instruments can be remixed and respatialized in the real-time diffusion. This leads to a metaphorical form of democratization of access to sound, as the musicians can reassign their placement in the virtual space, while heterogeneous timbres can be remixed and rebalanced. The hierarchy of roles assigned to the different instrumental groups in a classical ensemble thereby becomes scrambled and recoded. As for the role of the composer, it is in large part determined by the culture of the musicians participating in telematics concerts, exemplified by pioneering figures such as Paulino Oliveros. This culture, by its nature and history, encourages collaborative practices. The program notes of the pieces Picture Score 2020 by Hassan Estakrian, which you saw in the previous slides, and Whose Turn Is It Anyway by Michel Cheng, which you will see in a moment. Both composers were performed by the SNE in the last 2 years, exemplify this process, as they recognize these respective works as the product of a collective effort. The question of international community making is at the heart of networked performance. A significant example of this is a collaboration whose results, both artistic and musical, are still vividly remembered by the community of performers and musical technologists involved. In 2008, Beijing University and Stanford University were able to perform Pauline Oliveros' tuning meditation with beautifully clear audio, in Pauline Oliveros' words. Her contribution can be found in the proceedings of the ICMC from 2008 as part of the Commedia project. This kind of collaboration highlights the importance of thinking of collective practices as a way to enhance a sense of community in music making, precisely Oliveros' project in the aforementioned piece. At the same time, the technological means used make it possible for this community to identify as a community, despite the almost 6,000 miles that separate both campuses, Beijing and Stanford. As artistic and musical director of the Stanford New Ensemble, I have had during the pandemic to cultivate a sense of community of which students had been deprived. The outreach initiatives had to extend way beyond the usual students who register for the ensemble, as online music making with uncompressed audio and near zero latency was made available to virtually anyone interested, independently from the location at the time the pandemic started. Karma and the Department of Music sent tens of jack streamer kits that contained a mic, cabling, and a digital audio interface. The intimate sonic rendition of Jack Trip, once the initial setup was done, made it possible for all SNE's participants to maintain an ensemble musical activity in a virtual acoustic space that made them feel in the same room, even though some of them were thousands of miles away from the Bay Area where Karma servers are located. Because of the long distance, we oftentimes had to use a larger window size with more latency so as to avoid glitches and packet loss. That technological aspect also determined musical and compositional strategies as to what was possible and how. Reflecting on my own experience using these tools in pedagogical settings, the community building potential of networked performance is clear, especially in the context of the pandemic era. As a sense of belonging to a learning community was made very difficult for many students, the impression of shared audio space provided by network performance, as opposed to video conferencing software, which is designed for turn-taking in audio rather than simultaneity, made them feel as though they were in the same room, even though the room was the internet, a virtual room. This creation of a shared virtual space has allowed for the formation of musical ensembles which connect across geographical distance, allowing students who spent significant periods of the pandemic in other states or other countries to remain connected with their classmates in a unique space for sonic sharing. And as a conclusion, the question of technology, so in that case, latency, quality of service, frames per packet, etc., is not simply a question of the milieu in which music is being performed, a milieu which you would hope would provide optimal sonic rendition. The question of technology is here intra-musical, reevaluating the notion of sonic space in the light of its becoming an online virtual space implies reevaluating both the notions of sonic object and musical object, i.e. the notion of artwork itself. Rethinking the notion of artwork implies questioning its genealogy. In the context of products of the mind, it means questioning the notion of authorship as it was inherited from modern philosophy centered around the notion of subject and consciousness. Highlighting the decentering of the authorial presence seems to involve a paradox. I have argued in favor of distributed performance as a musical practice that has the potential to hierarchize the traditional roles of music making as they are traditionally delineated by different specialisms, and to thus help potentially marginalized practices by underrepresented artists and technologists emerge and gain visibility and audibility. The paradox, the decentering of the authorial presence, is valid for as long as the discussion remains informed by subject philosophy. A more eloquent and potentially fecund approach to the disappearance of the author consists of reconsidering the notion in a different philosophical context. If we leave philosophy of consciousness aside, a holistic approach to philosophy of mind reveals itself to be a suitable analogy to the way musical minds interact with each other in a virtual space. To the question of whether the mind is inside or outside, the performer will respond, along with Charles Sanders Peirce or Ludwig Wittgenstein, for example, outside, within the public sonic sphere. This change of perspective also exists in Barth's text, although it reaches different conclusions, as he notes in a somewhat paradoxical way that the death of the author has the emergence of the reader as a corollary. I'm quoting Barth. We know that to restore to writing its future, we must reverse its myth. The birth of the reader must be ransomed by the death of the author. In the context of distributed performance specifically, there is no doubt that engagement with aspects of contemporary philosophy of mind and aesthetics as they help thinking network performance could aid those of us who reflect upon musical praxis towards renewed developments of the sonic realm, compositional principles, and musical material. And now to finish, I would just like to conclude by playing two brief excerpts. The first one, just a 1 minute example from the Stanford New Ensemble performing a text score by Stockhausen from Aus den Sieben Tagen, 1969, as text scores lend themselves ideally to network performance. And the second example would be Michel Cheng's piece, Whose Turn Is It Anyway, which is based on a British show from the late 1980s called Whose Line Is It Anyway? The two main puppet characters in her piece are Flappy the dog and Randy the squirrel, whose action triggers certain musical gestures and figures. That would be for the Stockhausen, and a couple of seconds from Michel Cheng's piece, a polyrhythmy. Voilà. Thank you very much.